Okay, so how many people are here by show of applause from Irvington High School? Okay, that's good. How many people are here by show of applause from Foothill High School? Yeah! And you've all just clustered in one little space, haven't you? And how many people are here from Amador High School? Okay. So, yeah. See, I feel like that you guys got like a little bit of time to like work up to it. That's very nice. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to introduce ourselves and then we'll get into it. My name is Clinton Woods. I am the president of Californians Advancing Civic Education. For those of you who were here last week, you have already heard this spiel, but basically Californians Advancing Civic Education is an organization that's been around since about 2012 that's dedicated to helping students like you get the most out of your time in the We the People program and other programs like it. I am an alum of the We the People program from 1995 from a school called Amador Valley High School. But I like all of the high schools, really I do. It's true, it's true. And this organization was set up specifically to, hi guys, specifically to help as many high schools as they could, because we all, and you're going to meet a bunch of the volunteers in a second, we all love the program. It changed our lives in various ways. It certainly changed mine, and it matters to us to give back. So the first person I'm going to introduce is the most important person in the room, because she is the reason why we are in the room, and that's Amy Kushner. She is the HR director for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which was where we are right now. Everybody should give her a big round of applause. Amy, can you tell the children a little bit about what EFF does?
I certainly can. The Electronic Frontier Foundation, we're about 30 years old. We are the premier organization defending civil liberties in the digital world. We have three components to our work. We're a nonprofit. We have our legal team. We do impact pro bono litigation, mainly on the First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, and fighting back bogus IP claims. We have our activism team. They try to stop bad legislation before it becomes law. They also do investigative reporting to uncover bad things happening by private companies. We have our technology team, and they write software that protects your privacy. We have Privacy Badger, which is an add-on for your browser, which will kill any processes that are collecting information that you do not want collected. And that is what we do. We have an intern program. We hire attorneys. We hire liberal studies majors. We hire everybody. So if you get to a point where you are interested in this kind of work, I am the person to talk to.
And if can you give them some examples of some major cases that you worked on or that
Sure.
EFF worked on?
We do work on net neutrality. That was a success for our activism team. Our legal cases, you may have recently heard of Carpenter versus the United States, which we were one of the major legal teams on that. We have Jewel versus the NSA, which was dealing with the illegal spying of U.S. citizens. And that, we get our cases by literally people who email us into info@eff.org and say, hey, I've had a problem. And in the case of Jewel, we literally had a guy who worked for AT&T walk in our front door with a stack of paper and said, maybe you should look into this.
And said, basically the NSA is collecting all of your metadata. All of your metadata.
Yeah.
So that'll happen in this building. It's an honor for us to be here. And so I just think it's really cool and we should highlight that. So.
Just some practical things. There are 2 bathrooms on each floor. All of the bathrooms are gender neutral. Each floor has 1 single stall and 1 double stall. You can lock the main door on the double stall if you prefer it to be private. Wireless, if you need it, use the openwireless.org.
Okay.
Is that a secure network?
That is run by Open Wireless. You can't be on the EFF network.
And then the other CACE volunteers, if you guys want to come up so that the cameras can catch you as well. That's you, Vikram. That's you, Sabrina. There you go.
It's more fun if we be awkward about it first.
No, yeah.
Hey everyone, my name is Vikram Srikanti. I'm a third-year PhD student in computer science at Berkeley, and also an alumni of the program from Foothill. In 2012, I was in Unit 3.
Hi everyone, I'm Sabrina McGraw. I'm a law student at Berkeley. I'm also an alumni of the program from 2013 at Amador, and I was on Unit 5.
Hi, Beck Mankowski, not an alum of the program, but I am on the board of Californians Advancing Civic Education and been involved with the program for the last 5 or so years. I feel like I should step forward and repeat a phrase. The height line up here.
Yeah, that's right.
Hi, I'm Sean Gentry. I'm an attorney at a law firm down the street called Ad Astra Law Group. My main practice is employment law for both employers and employees, wrongful termination cases, wage and hour cases, things like that. And I'm also an alumni of the program. I went to Foothill, graduated the year 2002, and I was Unit 1 back then, so still love the Unit 1 now.
Brian, can we get on camera here?
I am on camera.
That's a different camera.
No,
The webcast is this one.
I'm Brian Ladd. I've been involved in the program for this will be my 27th year, so, and I hate Unit 1. So guess who will be doing Unit 1? So, I'm always around. A lot of people in here were my former students, or I worked with them, or judged them, or other, like quite a few actually, from multiple high schools. So anyways, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's going to be a blast.
Brian is significantly underselling himself. He's one of the most accomplished We the People teachers in the country, if not the most accomplished We the People teacher. He has multiple national medals.
Second place.
He has multiple state championships. He is, so it's a privilege to have him here. This is his first year as a CACE volunteer. So want to hand out some things. You're going to be getting some papers throughout the day. If you need extra copies of these papers afterwards, we can email them to you. It's not a problem. We're handing out something that you're going to be using to make name placards. Everybody who came last week was really excited about name placards and making that. It's like arts and crafts, and we get to do it all over again. And what name placards are we're handing out papers, and you'll see that one side has some writing on it already. The other side has no writing on it. You're going to fold this document into 3, one for each branch of the federal government.
And if you have extras, pass them forward.
And then you're going to write your name on it. This is complicated. You're going to write your name. You're going to write the school where you're from. And then you're also going to write, if you have any pronouns that you prefer or want to share, that's great. Okay? Yes?
Pass any extras
So
forward.
you're not going to prop it up yet, because and I don't know if you've noticed this, you're not sitting at a table. But eventually you will be. And the reason why you're going to be making these name placards is eventually you are going to be practicing a congressional hearing, a We the People hearing. That is something that you will do at the end of today, okay? The folks who were here last week have some experience at it. The folks who were not, this is going to be your first opportunity. So for the folks who were not here last week, how many of you, like, first of all, if you were not here last week, if you could raise your hands. Okay, great. Of those people, how many of you have seen a We the People hearing before? Okay, so not all of you, about half of you, and you're doing one of these. Okay, that's fine. So a We the People hearing, and you're going to see an example of it done by our amazing alumni volunteers. There's a bunch of folks over here who have graduated in the last couple of years who love the program so much that they are willing to show up on a Saturday afternoon, or Saturday morning, in their summer. And unlike you guys, there's like no tangible benefit for them whatsoever. Like, they're not preparing for anything, they just want to give back. Mr. Ladd is going to be talking to you in a bit about civic duty and civic responsibility, and that is like them demonstrating civic duty and civic responsibility. But anyway, they are going to also demonstrate a We the People hearing. So for those of you who have not seen one, you're going to see it live. But basically, it's like a congressional testimony. There's going to be a panel of judges that are basically like the Congress people. And then you, in that panel, are going to come up and testify as if you were in front of a congressional hearing. You might have seen a congressional hearing in the news. And you're going to be asked a question in advance of the congressional hearing. You will give a testimony. In the We the People program, the testimonies will be about 4 minutes long. Today, the testimonies that you're going to learn how to prepare are going to be about 2 minutes long. And then afterwards, the judges or the Congress people are going to have an opportunity to ask follow-up questions. You're not going to know what the follow-up questions are in advance. You just have to come up with good answers.
Speaking of questions, I think there's a question back here.
What's that?
Do you have a question?
I just need something hard to write on.
Oh.
Okay. If you can't, just write. Yeah, there you go.
And with regard to all of our volunteers, all of them or almost all of them are national top 5 contestants for the We the People program. So these are very accomplished students. They were excellent in the years that they were in the We the People program. So you should try to take advantage of their knowledge when you can, not just today, but throughout the year. Either by email or in person when they're talking to you throughout the day today.
Yeah. So one thing that I want you to write down, if you can, or take it down on your notes, the prompt for today, the thing that we are all going to be testifying about and we're going to be judging you on is this. What is the most important duty of citizenship? Okay? What is the most important duty of citizenship? And what is the least important duty of citizenship? You'll notice with these types of questions, what is the most important duty of citizenship? What is the least important duty of citizenship? There isn't really a right answer. There's an answer that I think is correct, but that answer that I think is correct is not going to be the same answer that Mr. Ladd thinks is correct, that Ms. Mankowski thinks is correct, that all of the other folks think is correct. So it's subjective, and that's the idea, is that you're going to have to come up with reasons why you're giving that testimony. And so with that, Mr. Ladd, are you ready to take things away? Oh, no, you're right. So first, actually, what we're going to do is we are going to talk about how you're going to be scored. And we talked a little bit about this last week. There are 6 categories of how you're going to be scored. If somebody could grab some of the category sheets and the score sheets over there. And we'll pass these out for your reference.
We're just passing out score sheets and the descriptions right now.
That's right.
Yeah, just those 2 PDFs. Yes.
Okay. So what we're...
I've got the score sheets.
Great. What Mr. Gentry is passing out are the actual score sheets that judges use to judge you during your competitions. There are 6 categories. And the reason why we're passing these out, the reason why we're talking about them is that, what's that?
Is that thank you?
And if you could also...
Just pass them forward once you run out of them. Pass these back too?
Those are different.
Oh, I'm sorry. Are you asking?
Okay. So the reason why we're passing those out is to get you familiar with the categories. That way, when you are coming up with your testimonies, when you're coming up with your Q&As, these 6 categories of points that you can get are fresh in your mind, are there for you, that you'll be thinking about these categories when you're formulating your answers. Last week we focused heavily on 2 of them. We focused heavily on understanding and participation. Understanding meaning, did you understand the question? Participation meaning, did you speak during the hearing? Did you say something? Today we're going to focus on 2 other ones. We're going to focus on constitutional application and we're going to focus on supporting evidence. Okay? That's constitutional application and supporting evidence. The volunteers are going to talk. I don't know what's going on.
Say, if you're on the video call, can you please mute?
Oh, sorry. If you're on the video call, could you please mute your speaker? Because I think we're getting some feedback.
Somebody put us on hold.
I think that it was. I think somebody might have put us on hold. That's fine. Okay, I think that we're okay. All right. So does everybody have a score sheet and then the understanding sheet, or excuse me, the scoring criteria descriptions? You should look over these and keep, like I said, keep them in your mind.
And there's one more. There's the
right.
judging criteria.
The judging criteria. So, yes.
I don't have the understanding. That one.
This one?
Yeah.
Great. Okay.
What do you need?
Missing one of the three.
Yeah, there's three. So there's, okay, there should be one of these. Okay.
Yeah, there's a stack right next. Okay. So, yeah.
Can we have that one?
Sure.
This around here.
Go ahead. Here.
Scramble all of that.
Okay, everybody who's a volunteer here, excuse me, or is a CACE volunteer has judged at one or more competitions. We've all done it, and so we will all be judging at various levels of your competitions going forward. Some of us all of us, I believe, have judged at the district and regional level where you qualify to go to state. Hopefully you will all qualify to go to state. Most of us have judged at the state level where we decide whether you qualify to go to nationals. Some of us have been lucky enough to judge at the national level where we decide whether you win medals. So that's fun. But what that means is that when we're all talking about what we're looking for as judges, you should be paying attention. And one of the things that CACE is here for is we're here as resources for you. When you are in the future, when you're writing your testimonies, when you're thinking about your Q&As, when you're thinking about, well, how would judges feel about this aspect of a testimony? How would judges feel about this aspect of a Q&A if we said this? We're here because we are your judges and you can ask us, right? I'm not going to tell you, none of us are going to tell you, this is how I'm going to judge you. And if you say this, it will be right, and if you say that, it will be wrong. But we are here as a resource, and you can ask questions about how would a judge, a theoretical judge, feel about this particular question. And most of the alumni volunteers who have showed up have definitely used us as a resource, and we hope that you guys will do that in as well, or you will do that as well. So Vikram is here to talk about constitutional application. So
Right.
take it away.
So I don't know if you guys have heard, but this program is about the Constitution. So talking about the Constitution in your testimony and your Q&A is going to be really, really important. And so that's one of the criteria that's on the like, when you get scored, there's 6 criteria, and you get a score out of 10 for each one. So last week we talked about understanding and participation. Did everyone participate? Did you actually understand the question that you were being asked, and do you respond to it? And then constitutional application is another one of those. And the idea is that you want to make sure that you are demonstrating in a very concrete way that you understand how the answers that you're giving are not just intelligent answers, are not just opinions that you have in answering the question, but also really take things back to the Constitution. And understand what the principles that underlie your responses, your opinions, your theories, whatever it is that you're presenting, how does that tie back to the Constitution, and what is the basis in the Constitution for the answers that you're giving? So the most obvious way that you can present that is by citing literal clauses in the Constitution. If you're talking about the Commerce Clause and you're talking about, the necessary or proper clause, then that's and obviously you have to understand what you're saying, but if you cite those clauses, that's always a good way to demonstrate that you understand where the constitutional grounding of your answers are coming from. But it doesn't just have to be citations to the Constitution, because there's not always going to be a constitutional citation for everything that you are going to want to give an answer for. So this can come in a variety of other ways too. This can come if you're, sort of citing Supreme Court cases and you understand how the ruling was made in the Supreme Court case. Obviously, the justices who are writing these cases, or not just Supreme Court cases, court cases in general, when the judges and justices are writing their opinions, they're going to go back to the Constitution as well. And so the more you understand the reasoning that they are applying on top of the Constitution and can take that back again to the Constitution is going to be really important. And so sort of having a well-grounded understanding of sort of from the bottom up, understanding where in the Constitution these principles are relevant, understanding how they're being applied, and then understanding how they're relevant to the particular answer that you're giving is going to make a really, really good score in that constitutional application section, right? So it's not just, you can't just like shotgun a bunch of clauses and hope that, if I cite enough Article 1, Section 8 clauses, I'll have, sort of picked up on something Congress can't do and it'll be fine. That doesn't necessarily work, right? You have to really, you want to pick fewer examples, but really dive into them and understand the grounding and the relationship and sort of draw out those examples more so that you can, give a more coherent and concrete answer.
So I have a question. What if a judge asks a question that is not specifically about the Constitution? For example, they ask a question about political philosophy from antiquity. They ask about Aristotle, or they ask about Cicero, or they ask about something like immigration. It isn't necessarily specific to a power of government. How do you bring that back into the Constitution?
Yeah, so that's a great question. In terms of political philosophy, as you guys might have heard, and you will learn more about today in a few minutes when Mr. Ladd starts presenting, there's actually a lot of political philosophy that underlies and underpins the Constitution. So you can go back to things like the Federalist Papers, or the writings of the framers and the founders, where they actually talked about political philosophy and how political philosophy sort of influenced their ideas, and you can then draw connections from those ideas that they present in the Federalist Papers, for example, and what actually was put into the Constitution, or what even wasn't put into the Constitution. And that ties into things like, immigration as well, where people had opinions about things like immigration or naturalization. It may not have necessarily been the original framers, but people like John Bingham, who wrote the 14th Amendment, had opinions on these things. And he may not count as one of the original framers, but he sure as hell had an important impact on the Constitution because he wrote the 14th Amendment with a certain intention, and whether or not that intention was carried out in the same way that it was written is sort of, history is played out in a different way, right? But understanding both the people that sort of wrote these documents that put together the underpinnings of our democracy, of our republic, also helps, because then you can go to their ideas and their intentions, and that actually will make your answer even stronger, because now you can say, look, John Bingham intended X, here's what the courts did after that, or here's what whoever did after that, and here's like where the mismatch came. And if you can give that kind of answer where there's intention, document in history, or like how things have played out in history, that's going to be even more nuanced, and it's going to make your answer even stronger.
Does anybody else have any other questions about constitutional application? No? Okay. Cool. Then we're going to talk about the other category. Sabrina?
Yeah, I'm gonna cover types of evidence. So I actually have another handout for you all. So maybe just distribute that really quick.
You guys.
If you have extras, just put them on the table or pass them up to the front.
Does everyone get one?
I've seen that.
Okay, so supporting evidence is the category that I'm going over, and I think supporting evidence is the one category that can make you stand apart from all the other teams, because anyone can eventually, once you study this and get to familiar with the subjects, can have an opinion about something, but bringing in evidence that supports what you're trying to say is going to stand out and increase your scores. So there's about 7 different types of evidence that you can use and bring up that will help to support your ideas when you're trying to make points. And one of the first ones is what we've talked about already, which is bringing up philosophy, political philosophy. And when you bring up political philosophy, it's really important to give the philosopher you're referencing sort of the idea and oftentimes the text that you're citing to, so that your judge can understand that you did the research and understand the context for where this philosophical idea is coming from. For example, some of you may have heard of Montesquieu before. He's the person who developed the idea of the 3 branches of government. So say you're trying to respond to a question about why the veto power that the president has is good or bad. Well, you can bring up Montesquieu and talk about why he thought it was important to have 3 separate branches of government sort of checking each other and understanding that liberty wouldn't be possible without that. And sometimes you can also even cite small phrases to describe your idea. And then another example you can bring up is historical events or examples. And this one can be really powerful, but also can be problematic depending on how you characterize a historical event, because all of our understanding of history can be characterized by our ideas. But it also can be very powerful, and I recommend you try and bring it in when you're making points. So for example, if you're talking about how you don't think the president should have unlimited power in the area of foreign policy, you could bring up a historical example of Executive Order 9066 and talk about how Japanese internment came out and was justified by the president of this idea that he had unlimited power to protect people. And a lot of people don't think that Japanese internment was a great policy, and the Supreme Court had held that you didn't need to check the president essentially in this area of foreign policy, and that it was justified. And you can talk about how you don't think that's a good outcome. Another idea is that another supporting evidence is talking about laws, actions, or policies that are going on that Congress has passed in the past or has passed right now. And the policies don't have to be written down. They can also be executive orders, like I just mentioned. For example, you could bring up, and they can also be from local government or state government. So for example, if you're talking about direct democracy, California has an initiative system where we bring up propositions that have ideas. So you could talk about, for instance, Proposition 8, which was making marriage between a man and a woman. And you can talk about the pitfalls of having direct democracy, about citizens making laws instead of legislatures, and talk about how that impacts it. And then another example is current events. And this is something that you guys are going to, if you don't already stay in touch with a lot of current events, I strongly recommend you start reading the news now, because current events are super important to being successful in this program. And if you need a way to get started, I recommend looking up podcasts, which are a great way to get little bursts of information. I recommend The Daily by the New York Times, or also Up First by NPR to get news in news. And you can also talk about local current events, because a lot of times, especially once you start competing with teams from other states, a lot of times you can bring in personal anecdotes from where you come from, and that can be really strong. For example, you can bring out the current event of the white woman who called the cops on an African American in Oakland for barbecuing. You can talk about how that impacts, how that shows how race is being treated in America, and reflect it back. Next is precedent. This is one of the biggest ones that you'll be using, especially if you're in Unit 5 Bill of Rights. This is about Supreme Court cases or Ninth Circuit court cases. Anytime you have an idea, especially when you're trying to apply constitutional application, it's really good to have a Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court justice is saying what you're trying to say. And what's important to note is you don't have to use the majority opinion in a Supreme Court case. You can talk about the concurrence by justice or dissent to try and justify your ideas. But what's really important is when you're citing a Supreme Court case to always include the date and also the person that you're citing and whether or not it's a majority, concurrence, or dissent. That will give your answer more nuance and strengthen what you're trying to say. Next we have statistics. So this would be something like current trend in what's going on that provides evidence for what you're trying to say. For example, 66% of Americans cannot find France on a world map, or 50% of global warming was caused by 90 companies. It's really good to find examples that are shocking and also true, and make sure to cite your statistics where you're coming from. And you can just do it very quickly, but it lends credence to what you're saying. You don't want the judge to have a follow-up question be, where did you get that statistic? Because one, that wastes time, and two, you should be saying that already because that shows that you did your research and you understood what's going on.
Sabrina, how would you give a statistic like that or a citation to a statistic by citing the statistic at the same time? How would you do it? Can you give an example?
Sure. I can't think of
No, so
this example, but
so for example, if it would be like 66% of Americans cannot find France on the world map, it would be like, according to a Pew Research study from 2011, etc. What?
60% might be overly generous.
I'm just saying. So you want to cite who took the study, who commissioned the study, that sort of thing.
and also when.
When.
Super important.
Right.
For context of what's going on. And then the last section is personal story or anecdotes. Now this one you have to be very careful with your anecdotes because sometimes anecdotes aren't as powerful as you think and can actually hurt. So you have to use them sparingly and try and use them in a context you think is appropriate. These are hard to find examples for, but when I was in Unit 5, I had a question about the Fourth Amendment, my team did. And right around this time, we had on Amador Valley's campus, they were changing the policy about drug-sniffing dogs. So our unit actually brought in a personal anecdote about how the drug-sniffing dogs coming onto campus was impacting our education and impacting how we were interacting. But again, you have to be really careful with personal anecdotes. Because you don't want them to try and represent something larger than what you're trying to do. Another good personal anecdote is when you're talking about how civic education impacts us, because we're the students that are beneficiaries of civic education, especially this program.
If I can interject one thing on anecdote. So a trap that you don't want to fall into is the, like, I have this thing, this story that happened to me that's kind of tangentially related, and so I'm going to figure out a way to bring that in. The story that you tell, if you are using an anecdote, needs to be, just like with the statistic, it needs to be relevant to what you're talking about, and it needs to be on point. So just like any other type of evidence, you don't tell an anecdote to be like, cool story, bro. You tell an anecdote to support what you're saying, to illustrate what you're saying. So that's the purpose of the anecdote. So always remember that you're not giving a testimony to support your anecdote, you're using an anecdote to support your testimony.
Is an anecdote something that's better used in like a Q&A or in a testimony?
I think the answer can be both, right? And it depends on the anecdote. And actually, that answer goes for every one of these types of evidence. Ideally, you want to have a good blend. Like, you don't want to have a testimony or a Q&A that's just all Supreme Court cases ever, or all statistics ever. But like if there is a relevant answer that you can bring in an anecdote, it can be very powerful. For example, I've seen some of the best Q&As I've ever seen are when somebody asks an immigration question, and if you have an immigration story, if you're the child of immigrants, if you are an immigrant yourself, then that's a really powerful thing to bring up. It is. But some of the worst Q&As I've ever seen have been like, I've asked questions at state competitions where about Fourth Amendment and had somebody go, well, my dad's a cop and he says this. Yeah. It's like, that's not good evidence. That's not just because your dad said something, that's not necessarily a thing. So I guess to answer your question, it can be it's both, but you just have to be careful.
Going back to current events, does it have to be an event that happened in the U.S. or could it be something like that happened outside? For example, like Brexit or something.
And make sure you're repeating the questions for the.
Oh yeah, so he asked if the current event or historical event has to be from the United States or can be elsewhere. Definitely can be elsewhere, especially if you're in Unit 6, but this could apply to anything. You want to be bringing in, actually, examples from other countries because a lot of times they mirror things that we could adopt, or you might be trying to make an argument for us, say, adopting the parliamentary system in government, something like that. So definitely don't limit your scope to the United States. Any other questions?
Yeah, the one other thing I would say about this is that the most important thing when you're finding evidence, when you're finding supporting evidence, is to find the best supporting evidence for your point. Not necessarily the most obvious ones, and a lot of times they're not the same thing. Like, for example, I judge Unit 5s a lot, and Unit 5 definitely deals with like First Amendment issues a lot, and everybody always brings up the Voltaire quote, the "I will defend," or "I don't like what you say, but will defend to the death your right to say it." And that's like an obvious, famous quote, but it's not always relevant to the First Amendment issue that you're talking about.
He also never said that.
Right. I agree. But it's like.
But you'll die to defend the right to say.
Yeah, but you will not die to defend. I will die to defend the right of people to wrongfully attribute that to Voltaire. But the point is, like, find the best evidence, and it's going to take you a long time to figure out what the best evidence is. It's going to take you a lot of Q&As, but that's the point. Is like you want to find the best evidence, not the most obvious one.
Yeah, you're gonna keep going through and revising your ideas over and over again throughout this entire process. I must have revised my testimony maybe 30 times, full stop revised, with trying to find different parts of evidence and looking at things in a different way. So never feel like you got it all figured out right away and you're good to go, because most likely there's always more to learn and there's always more things that you can bring in.
For Q&A, should you still, if you have an answer to the Q&A but you can't think of evidence to support it at the time, should you still answer, or should you not and just say I don't have any evidence, there's no real?
You should definitely still answer.
No, not say that, but just don't answer.
So the question was if you don't remember the evidence off the top of your head, but you do have an answer to the question, whether or not you should answer it or remain quiet. The answer is definitely answer the question. Participation, like they talked about last time, is a huge part of your grade as well. So even just speaking up and saying something intelligent will show well. But the whole point of bringing up this evidence now is that you're starting to build all the information that you know in your head, and so you'll be able to bring up and support the answers that you're bringing up.
And hopefully one of your teammates will be able to plant that evidence.
Right. Exactly.
And remember that the evidence is a tool to help support what you are saying. But the most important thing that we want out of this is for you to say what you need to say what you want to say in response to that question, and then use evidence to support what you're saying. So it's not like you can't say anything if you don't have a piece of evidence to back it up. I mean, don't just say stuff for the sake of saying stuff. But if you have things to say and you don't know the specific citation, then say, I don't remember the specific citation, but so-and-so said this, or even just saying it.
The other thing I'd point out real quick about the whole sort of score sheet is that the categories that we're sort of laying out are ways that the judges will score you, or like a framework the judges use to score you, but they're not mutually exclusive. So if you think about all the things that Sabrina was just mentioning in terms of in terms of Supreme Court cases or current events or the Constitution, those all actually also fall under constitutional application. If you think about what I was talking about when I was saying you want to sort of build up from the Constitution through history and current events and all those kinds of things, that's both evidence and constitutional application and reasoning and to some extent responsiveness and understanding, because you're trying to understand the question, respond to it, make sure that you're demonstrating how you're thinking through your ideas and so on, right? So use this as a framework to understand how the scoring is going to work, but also make sure that the most important thing is that your ideas are coherent and that they fit together. And that's what's going to make your answers really strong. It's not like you just need to pepper random constitutional references in or pepper random current events in just to build up one of these scores, because they'll all sort of build off of each other. Like as you add more information, you'll bring in current events and history and whatever, and all of those things will tie into all of the sort of different categories that'll be relevant to your responses.
Great. So with that, we're going to turn things over to Mr. Ladd.
Can you say that okay?
Yeah. We'll close the skylight if it else.
Facetiously, I said, I hate this unit. I guess it wasn't facetious. I don't like it. However, this is the most important unit of all 6 units. Okay, it's absolutely the most important unit of all 6 units. We have people that are far more adept at discussing this than I am. However, they will talk for like 6 hours, and I have 20 minutes. Because I thought about it, I said, oh, there's Max and Nithya and da-da-da. And I was like, no way. If I was going to look at anything this summer, I would be reading, how many of you have your textbooks? I'd be reading Unit 1 over and over and over again, okay? Because it is expected, if I judge, that you're able to bring in these philosophers into every single unit in there. Kids often shy away from Unit 1, but you can't do that, so it's absolutely critical. Now, shut your lids. Shut your lid. You can't keep up with me. So there's no point in trying to take notes. The PowerPoint has far more slides than I'm going to be able to cover, doing part now, part later. However, Amy, they'll have access to be able to see the PowerPoint?
They have it.
Okay, so no notes, just listen. Okay, just listen. Those of you who heard me lecture, I like to be everybody looking at me, and et cetera. If I knew your names, I'd call on you nonstop. So this is the essential or overall guiding question: what are the philosophical and historical foundations of the American political system? Hopefully this sheet's not far enough. Can you put it forward for me? All right, so this is question 1 for Unit 1. What are the essential differences between classical republicanism and the natural rights philosophy, and how do these differences appear in America's founding documents? And the group that will present today are going to talk about classical Republican. That's why I'm doing classical Republican first. Again, I am throwing a stone across a lake, skimming it, but it's going to sink after like 10 yards offshore, so there's a whole lot of stuff. Good. So both traditions emphasize human nature, and there's controversy about what the state of human nature is, the purpose of politics, and by the way, their version of politics isn't our version of politics today. It's completely different. And what's a good and bad government? All right, I'll just do that each time. So main differences, again, I'm skimming. Main ideas of classical republicanism, it's about the polis, okay? Nithya, what does the polis mean? Small city state. Civic virtue. Max, what's civic virtue mean?
Never had to define it.
That's a failure in of itself.
To be a part of their own state.
Say it again?
Oh, like the willingness and activeness of citizens in their own state.
I'm not so sure it's willingness, it's that you need to, you must. Who saw the movie 300? Okay? I used to ask that question to every kid, oh, like this. Okay, you do what's good for the city-state. Sparta ring a bell for anybody? All right. Homogeneity, stability, justice as order, functional social hierarchy, all within the realms of benefiting society first. Where natural rights philosophers talk about the natural person versus the civil person, you can read through this later, fundamental rights, individual sovereignty, and then the social contract. Classical republicanism, Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, St. Thomas. If you look at this, it goes from Greeks forward. Anybody think there's any examples of classical republicanism in your communities?
Yes.
Hopefully I don't ask that question and judging you all do that. Go for it.
I mean, as part of Scouts, there's kind of like a duty to give back to your community as part of like service projects.
Who has a service learning or a community service requirement at their school? You all do. I know the answer to that already. That's that whole enlightened self-interest. You're going to benefit yourself because you're helping to pad your resume for college. And then you're actually going to benefit your community at the same time. All right, human beings. And by the way, each slide, I could probably go on for a half hour to 45 minutes. So there's a lot more to it than this. Human beings are by nature polis. They're animals, okay? Unique capacities and talents. But in classical republicanism, we rein in those talents to best do what? Promote the society itself. Strong communities make happy and virtuous people. Think about that in today's application. We don't really have communities like we used to have. People don't know each other in their neighborhoods. I've lived in a condo complex now for 26 years, and I know 2 people because I go to work, and that's my community, or it was my community. Human beings have unique excellence, reasoning and speaking well. Classical Republicans believe that everybody has a purpose. Who's read Brave New World? Okay, alphas, the omegas, you are born into a certain organization or you're born in with certain talents and they use those talents. I would not think our society should be like that at all. It requires education, an educated society. It doesn't mean you are all going to get PhDs. It means you're educated in what's best for society. Order, discipline, and public spiritedness. You're failing me. All right. Purpose of politics is to achieve happiness in small, contained communities. Can you think of examples of a larger community, but the smaller community is actually much better than the larger community? Who lives in Fremont? Okay. Do you have a lot of small communities within Fremont? Yes, you do. And those communities mine. If you go to San Francisco, there's a whole bunch of small communities all over the place. And so those are examples of communities that are more homogenous than your greater community itself. Promote civic virtue, enlighten self-interest, and then maintain strong defenses. And go back to the Greek city-states. Good government, small, self-contained community. Keep hearing this idea of community all the way through. Excuse me. Proper balance among members. Okay, so everybody has a role. Nobody sits on the side, except, of course, the philosophers. Primary focus is on education. And some people say this can be the same thing as indoctrination. Is public education in the United States a classical Republican idea?
Yes.
It is. And we were the first country in the world to promote education for everyone. And most countries have adopted that since. Wise deliberative rule, that can be, think about today, think about all our different presidents, our leaders. Civically virtuous citizens. We do what's best for the state first, and then what's best for us second. And then again, strong defenses. All right, bad government. Passions uncontrolled. Do you think there'd be a lot of tweeting in a classical Republican government? Well, ironically, many classical Republican governments were more dictatorial, but that's later. Preoccupation with material goods and pleasures. Golf, wine, steaks. Poor civic and personal virtue. And if you look at all of America, most Americans fail at this, okay? Because we are selfish, and that gets into all natural rights ideas. And then self-interested rulers, definitely bad. All right, early state governments had classical republicanism in it. Uniformity, religious. Many of the states were founded with a specific religion in mind, except Maryland, which is a state of religious tolerance. Come all Catholics, everybody else stay away. Religious citizen requirements, residency, property, gender, race. And that we go from Unit 1, and now we're putting in Unit 3 in there. So Unit 1 carries in all over the place. Small communities and regions, civic virtue is emphasized. You keep saying the same words over and over again. Now, which principles of classical Republican ideas to find America's founding documents? The group presenting today, that was their question, so I'm going to go pretty quick through this. Go ahead. Massachusetts, Constitution of 1780. When you start studying the constitutions and the charters, you're going to find some colony states had a whole bunch of these. The happiness of a people, the good order and preservation of civil government is essentially depend on piety, religion, and morality. Okay, so the good of its citizenry is based on these ideas. Pennsylvania, Constitution of 1776, right after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. A frequent recurrence of fundamental principles and a firm adherence to justice, moderation, temperance, industry, and frugality are absolutely necessary to preserve the blessings of liberty and keep the government free. Apply that in today's society. I doubt, as a society, there are almost no communities that do that today. Okay? And this is what you got to be able to do with Unit 1. It may seem old and crusty, but you have to apply it to today. Early American documents, I don't need to read those. All right, in the Constitution, the preamble, what's the first 3 words? So you're doing it together, right? The Senate, how does a Senate represent classical republicanism? Anybody take a good solid guess? No Unit 2 people to pipe in. How is the Senate chosen? Well, how was it originally chosen? By the state legislatures, okay? And everybody was equal and had equal representation there, okay? And they went back and they represented the states, actually a larger community. Eligibility requirements. Why eligibility requirements?
Because it promotes civic virtue. So
How? And that would be a question you would want to answer in a Q&A too. Go ahead.
Because basically you have the idea that you need to be moral and educated, and so those would be certain like eligibility requirements.
So if we're talking about voters,
Yeah.
you'd have to be a citizen. You have to be of a certain age. Do you have to be knowledgeable?
At first.
Are you kidding? Have you seen the voting? Most people don't know what they're voting for, and you'll see that. But what about elected officials? The House 25, the Senate 30, the President 35. The older the age, the more wisdom you have. And the more educated you are, and the better you'll help that society. We also used to have property requirements, right? Because if you own property, you had a vested interest. The choir singing, listen to the choir, because that's an answer. And plenary legislative powers left to the states. Katrina, what does plenary mean?
That, like, I don't know the exact definition of the word.
Anybody? Anybody over there? How did you guys play second and fourth at national? Go ahead, George.
Isn't, okay, the powers that aren't delegated explicitly to the national government?
All the powers, they're going to be the most powerful branch, to make it simple. Why? Because it's the people's branch, it's the community's branch in there. Go ahead. This will be after we hear the next session. That was quick, that was fast. I could have put 80 more slides in there. And by the way, I don't do PowerPoints. Most of you know I've never done a PowerPoint in my life except when I do this. Any questions at all? Really quick. I don't want to get natural rights and classical Republican, but just about the application of Unit 1 to other things. Okay. People shy away from it, but it's absolutely critical that you make sure you understand it, learn it, and then fold it into your entire program throughout the year. So thank you.
So you can give, yes, let's give him a round of applause. We love Mr. Ladd. He is a resource that everybody should use as much as possible. So what we're going to be doing now, we've been going for about an hour, is we're going to take a little break, and we're going to set up the alumni hearing that you're about to see. We're going to break for about 5 minutes. I do need... Okay. Okay. Thank you guys. So what we're going to be doing now, like we said, is we have a distinguished alumni panel that is going to introduce themselves. We also have a distinguished alumni panel of judges that are also going to introduce themselves. The way this would work at a competition hearing is that the panelists, who are you guys, these are the people who you are rooting for right here. These are the good guys. These are the bad guys. Here, the judges. These are the people who we root for. We all root for. But so what's going to happen? What would happen is you guys would be set up in your units at your table. The judges are going to enter the room. Everybody stands when the judges enter the room. For some reason, I have no idea why that happens, but it has been happening forever, and now you have to do it. It's just weird when you don't. So then they would come down and sit as they are now, and you guys as the judging panel will take it away. So you guys would introduce yourselves first, then allow them an opportunity to introduce themselves, and then read the question.
Okay. Hi, I'm Kala. I was Unit 6 alumni from this past year.
Hi, I'm Charlie, Unit 1 alumni from Foothill from this past year.
Hi, I'm Ani. I'm Unit 5 alumni from Foothill last year.
Hi, I'm Katrina. I'm a Unit 2 alumni from Amador the past year.
I'm Nithya. I'm a Unit 1 alum from Amador this past year.
I'm Ashna. I was on Unit 5 2 years ago.
I'm Mariah. I was on Unit 6 last year for Foothill.
I'm Justin. I was on Unit 4 last year for Amador.
And your question today is, how do America's founding documents reflect a classical Republican commitment to civic duties? In what ways do they fail to do so? You may begin when you're ready.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Founder John Adams asserted that revolutionary principles are those of Aristotle and Plato, Harrington and Locke, the principle upon which the whole government over us now stands. Our founders looked towards classical republican philosophers such as Aristotle and Cicero, who theorized that the end of the state was the common good rather than individual gain. Classical republicanism involves civic duty to the state, such as voting and other forms of civic participation.
Classical Republican civic duties are ingrained into American government and society. As listed by the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, the responsibilities of being an American citizen include supporting and defending the Constitution, participating in the democratic process, respecting and obeying federal, state, and local laws, paying taxes, serving on a jury, and defending the country if the need should arise.
Several of America's founding documents reflect a commitment to such civic duties. State constitutions are a particularly important source of these commitments, especially in promoting the classical Republican ideal of the common good. Section 16 of Virginia's 1776 state constitution, for example, states that it is a mutual duty of all to practice Christian forbearance, love, and charity towards each other. Additionally, Article 5 of the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776 states that the government ought to be instituted for the common benefit of the people, nation, or community, and not for the particular advantage of any part of that community.
Both the federal constitution and state constitutions highlight the civic duty of participating in military service when the need arises. Both Aristotle and Cicero elaborated upon the role of the citizen in state defense in De Legibus. Cicero declares that the safety of the people is the highest law. The select draft law cases of 1918 decided that the Constitution commands the power to compel military service as a civic duty. Both Georgia and New York's 1777 state constitutions require military service. New York states that whereas it is of the utmost importance to the safety of every state that it should always be in a condition of defense, and it is the duty of every man who enjoys the protection of the society to be prepared and willing to defend it. These founding documents illustrate participation in defense as a civic duty.
Another classical Republican commitment to civic duties exists in the concept of compulsory jury duty. The Seventh Amendment to the Constitution preserves the system of jury trials in accordance with definitions established by English common law. State constitutions, including the Massachusetts Constitution, also discuss an impartial jury, specifically one made up of one's peers. Compulsory jury duty was enforced even during the colonial era, as laws established in 1647 fined those who refused to serve. This jury duty is an implied inherent prerequisite to support the right to an impartial trial by peers.
On a national level, an important classical Republican duty reflected in our founding documents is taxation. Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution states that Congress shall have power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises, to pay the debts and provide for the common defense and general welfare of the United States. In this way, the government can oblige citizens to pay taxes to promote the common good.
In several aspects, however, our founding documents failed to command civic duty. Though some early state constitutions, such as Georgia, made voting compulsory, voting was never made mandatory on a national level. From the beginning, our founding documents emphasized voting as a right or responsibility rather than a duty. This was largely because our founders didn't believe that each individual should be able to participate in government for the fear of mob rule.
Our founding documents create several institutions distanced from the direct will of the people. Shays' Rebellion convinced founders such as Elbridge Gerry that the evils the country experienced flow from the excess of democracy. James Madison also argued that, in a direct democracy, the poor could always outvote the rich, which was against the founders' interests. This evidence supported an aristocratic Senate elected by state legislatures rather than the people, an independent judiciary, and an electoral college to elect the president, all with different degrees of separation from the people.
Though our founding documents encourage certain civic duties, they fall short of inviting civic participation from every citizen. Over time, more people have been allowed to participate in the political process, furthering classical Republican ideals. Thank you.
In your testimony, you mentioned people having the responsibility to support and defend the Constitution. To what degree should the standard citizen have to defend the Constitution? In what ways would they do that?
One way that we mentioned, of course, defending the Constitution is essentially defending our way of life. And in accordance with the draft, once you turn 18, you are expected to essentially defend that Constitution till the day essentially until you die if we end up going into conflict with a foreign power.
I think also using the rights that are outlined in the Constitution, such as in the First Amendment, freedom of speech, that you can use that to defend the ideals that the founders intended.
Our Constitution endows us with certain rights and responsibilities and certain privileges as citizens, and part of defending the Constitution should be participating civically and participating in civic duties as to further these constitutional ideals.
Should non-citizens have to adhere to these civic duties, and to what extent, if they do?
From a classical Republican standpoint, the Constitution and the citizenry is supposed to be contained within the community. And basically, if you look back to antiquity and during the times where these classical Republican ideals were created, the polis was a very isolated political sphere where non-citizens were considered the enemy. So I believe from a classical Republican standpoint, non-citizens shouldn't be involved in constitutional duties and civic duties.
I think that even non-citizens can participate in their communities and in civic duties. I think that in smaller communities, which are more ideal or more typical of classical Republican nature, non-citizens can still give back to their communities and participate in their communities in other ways that may not be through voting or something like that. They can participate in community service or volunteering efforts to give back to the community.
Can you elaborate on civic duty at the time of Aristotle and classical Republican times versus civic duty both at the time of founders or in the modern day?
So Aristotle, a prominent classical Republican philosopher, outlines civic duties that he believes are necessary in a polis in chapter 13 of Politics. Part of this include fines for not participating in jury duty and incentives to vote and incentives to politically participate. We can see parallels between then and now in things like mandatory jury duty, defense of the state, and rights such as voting.
During the founding era, the founders intended that civic duty should be left more up to the states. In Federalist 42, Madison states that the right to define the rights of citizenship should be left up to the states, so they believe that it should be much more at a local level than at a national level.
And in comparing the time of the founders to right now, civic duties have changed a little bit. Georgia's state constitution mandated voting. They had a fine if you didn't vote. I don't know if that was actually enforced very much, but today there is no mandatory voting across America, and there's none in Georgia either.
Do you think we should have mandatory voting?
I believe that this wouldn't be necessary since voting was endowed by the founders as a right and a responsibility rather than the duty. Part of the reason that the founders believe this, and I to a certain extent agree with them, is that if you mandate voting, people that aren't informed about government and aren't informed about politics will be made to vote, and this may not be the best for the political system.
Voting is essentially what a citizen can do to show their vested interest in the country's government, whether they care or not about who we elect as an official or as congressman, such as congressmen. And when we force mandatory voting, it just allows the people who don't have a vested interest to then randomly select such a person who might not even correctly represent their ideals. Mandatory voting is essentially is a mistake in its entirety because of the fact that people's ideals aren't represented realistically when they vote mandatorily.
I think in keeping with classical Republican ideals, it shouldn't have to be an either or. You can increase voter education, but state-funded voter education, which is part of a classical Republican ideal, and then you can also mandate voting so that you do have educated voters. I think mandatory voting could be a good idea because it increases voter turnout. In our last national election, I think we only had like 52% voter turnout, whereas mandatory voting would increase that turnout. In Australia, before they implemented mandatory voting, they had about 40 to 70% turnout, and after mandatory voting, it was 90%.
Does our government and modern society still require civic virtue? Do we still need civic virtue and civic duty today, and in what ways?
I think we definitely do need to have civic virtue and civic duty today, especially at a local level. Edmund Burke states that that we have little platoons that we need to be more interested in before we are a part of a national identity. And I think if we look to that idea, then we can really have more of an interest in our little platoons and give more back civically to that before we are at a national level.
In terms of our communities, I think that it's really necessary to participate civically. Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone illustrates the importance of this. Religious organizations and organizations that are not affiliated necessarily with the government, that are more community-based, such as the PTA and other like activist groups, are declining in participation. And these are necessary groups for the maintenance of our communities and the solidarity that we feel within them.
Time. That was a hearing. Judges, do you have feedback on that hearing, focusing on constitutional application and evidence? Or any feedback is fine, but if you want to mention that as well.
Okay, I guess I'll start. So good constitutional application, you could see in the testimony where there were citations to certain clauses and certain things. There were, and then in the Q&A, although there was less like this clause in the Constitution, by citing philosophers and events in the time of the founding and people in the time of the founding, then they were able to bring. It was a little bit like, it was, you guys want to have a lot more in general, but because you guys haven't done it in a while, so it's a little rusty, but like it's still like you sort of get the general basis of the kind of things you want to be bringing in with a couple more direct constitutional citations. One thing that's when you're presenting the testimony, just to take advantage of this, see the way like they're enunciating, and like so I noticed that some people would like blast their sentences, and then some people would like take their time. So you really want to find a good pace for that testimony, and like it's more about quality than quantity. Like say good things and a good pace where you can be understood more than like as much as you can fit in.
Yeah, I thought it was really good. The responsiveness was really nice. I thought that as soon as we asked the question, there was no pause. Someone jumped in immediately. You had good overall evidence. Yeah, I thought it was really good. There was one thing in the testimony. You talked about the 7th Amendment and how it gave a lot of like rights about jury trial and everything. I think you could have probably also said that a lot of it was also in the 6th Amendment, because the 7th Amendment is just a right to a jury trial in civil cases. Like there's not, the 6th Amendment is more along the lines of speedy and fair trial. By Pierre's 5th Amendment, it's obviously grand jury and etc. that you could probably put in, but this was very good.
Yeah, so I thought overall it's pretty good. So like the thing that's like really important for Unit 1 is citations. And I felt like you had most of them, considering like only one of you is Unit 1 and like you just wrote this testimony. So like, but like for future references, if any of you are Unit 1, every answer, as much as possible, should have a philosopher, some sort of philosophical idea or founder, as much as you possibly can. But I thought that was like pretty good, considering only one of you is Unit 1. You guys also like brought up some good citations. But I thought that some things could have been, like I felt like you could have cited more things. Like I heard at some point, like towards the end of your testimony, you cited something that Madison said. And that was really cool. It was a really good example, but I felt like you could have said like where exactly it was from in the year, right? So that really impresses judges. And also, I think you mentioned the 17th Amendment, right? So the shift from state legislatures electing senators to the people electing senators, but you didn't say the 17th Amendment, which would have gotten you like more constitutional application. Maybe you said it. I think I missed it, maybe. But yeah, overall it was like,
Yeah, I agree. I really enjoyed that. The testimony was really well written, and the Q&A was very good too. Like they said, responsiveness was really good. I guess there were like a couple of points where I would have liked to hear more, but again, it's been a while. For example, like the mandatory voting, like that would have been a good place, I guess, for everyone. Like a lot of other countries have tried mandatory voting, and so like that's what they were saying earlier about evidence, that you don't have to talk about the U.S. alone. So you could just bring in one of those countries and talk about how it worked or didn't work and use that to support your evidence. I guess on my question about having non-citizens, I would have liked to hear more. I got the philosophical base of the answer, but there's so much rich like application to that today, and as I don't know, I'm unistic, so I would it would have been like great to have heard something, especially like if you or your family is an immigrant, like that would have been a good personal anecdote. Like for example, one of my unit mates last year, she was like talking about how she was in the process of applying for citizenship and how she was participating in it. She wanted to participate but wasn't able to, or things like that. So, but other than that, I liked it.
All right, great, good job. I want to highlight, these volunteers just wrote this testimony probably this week, is my hunch, and like they did it, like this was excellent, I think. You know, like obviously there's, you know, we can nitpick the heck out of it, and we probably would, but like that's the level of testimony that you're gonna see at the regional and state level, and so it's really great that you guys spent the time to write that out to answer that question. Do you have a question back there?
So during the testimony, would you be sitting down and saying your testimony?
Yes. Yes. That you would be sitting down just like that, and yes.
Would it be better to like just read off your testimony the whole time and not look at the judges, or
you should look at the judges?
Yeah.
So you'll get to that. Generally, we recommend that you write out your testimony and read it, but you also want to have some eye contact with the judges at some point. You'll get there. Some schools, and it's fine if they do this, none of these three schools do it, but some schools in other areas memorize their testimonies. That's fine if you want to do that. It's not what we would necessarily recommend because it's hard to change the testimony, basically. But you want to have good eye contact when you can. So, yes.
So if your testimony goes a little bit at 4 minutes, is it like a hard stop, or are you allowed to finish your sentence?
Again, good question. So the question is if your testimony goes over 4 minutes, and these guys' testimony did go a little bit over 4 minutes, that's fine. In competition, they will cut you off at 4 minutes in the testimony. And the same thing in the Q&A. You might be able to go over a little bit if you're in the middle of a point, but typically they cut you off. So timing is very important, but again, we'll get through that. Okay? And we will answer all those types of questions, especially those kinds of questions about logistics. We're going to focus a lot on those in the third session that we're having next month. So, okay, great job, guys. Okay.
You guys took a break. Thanks, Layla. Just walk outside.
This should be good this time because it's always good to turn it on.
I want to show Matt.
Alrighty. Lids closed again. Anybody think they could have kept up with me? I can't even keep up with me. Alright, so natural rights philosophy. Ironically, natural rights philosophy comes from classical republicanism. And that's who Locke looked to, who you hear the most. And you're going to have an emphasis on these three guys. Alright? Two English philosophers. Anybody? Hobbes and Locke. One Swiss philosopher, not French philosopher. Rousseau was kicked out of Switzerland. How anybody gets kicked out of Switzerland is unbeknownst to me. But he spent his whole life in France. And I often hear kids, the French philosopher Rousseau is like, no, that's not who he was. So, all right, natural rights in the view of human nature. Humans are not social and political by nature. Equal rights in a state of nature. What does a state of nature mean? And don't say anarchy.
It's like as if there was no government and you're just like letting them exist.
Yeah. And some people call it social, economic, and political Darwinism, all types of things happening. Executive power is in the state of nature. And I'm not going to define that now because I have 15 minutes and that can take a day in itself. You must be protected from one another. So it's the old things that people say. Rousseau says, government governs with the consent of the governed. Okay, and he actually didn't say that, but that's a summary there. Okay, we give up rights in order to protect other rights. You all know that. Where, somebody give me an example of when you give up rights. Go for it.
You give up rights to free speech when you can engage other people?
Yeah, no right is absolute, except the Second Amendment. No right is All right. And then happiness is a personal, private matter. It's not a community matter. Okay? It's a personal, private. And there's going to be a struggle. One of the things I hear people say is that the Declaration of Independence is about natural rights. There's a whole lot of classical republicanism in it there too, and that's one of the first things your teachers will probably have you explore as you go through. Purpose of politics, self-preservation. How is that different than classical republicanism? It was that word, community, right? Maintain order, protect rights and liberties, your freedoms, and your common defense. Where are our liberties spelled out primarily in our document? The Bill of Rights, but many people could argue that, and you'll do this when you get Unit 2, you didn't necessarily need that Bill of Rights because the Constitution is so limited that they actually didn't have the ability to interfere. Oh, what else do we have? Common defense. All right, good government. People are sovereign. What does sovereignty mean? The people have the power. It's your choice there. You're free to make those decisions. Individuals are largely self-sufficient. Locke was all about that. You grow apples, you benefit from the apples. Okay, as you read Locke, it's apple trees. All right, government by consent. Government obeys the law. This is Unit 6 stuff too. Nobody's above the law. That phrase you'll see is rule of law. Okay, public-private spheres are separate. And that's a toughie. Because to protect my rights, the public has to govern with the private rights that we have too. In Declaration of Independence, Jefferson says what? That was like so vague, it was unbelievable. I'm going to go back. Natural rights philosophers believe in what natural rights?
Life, liberty,
property. Jefferson said pursuit of happiness, which is actually property according to Locke there. And so you see that. Most people don't know that, but you do now. Government provides what the people want. Hobbes says, I will provide security, therefore you will be better off because you actually don't know what's best for you. And then individual liberty, property protection. The Constitution, by the way, is full of property rights. Everywhere it's about property and contract and protections. Bad government is not representative. We could have a whole discussion about whether our current Congress is truly representative of the people who elect them. And you could argue, yes, they are, because those are the only people who elect them. They vote. It's not responsive. It violates rights, and it's not law-abiding. I could definitely click off 3 of these for the current government. And I'm not picking on parties because this has been going on for a while, and probably the 4th one to a point, too. All right, social contract theory. Again, going quick. What's the picture of? Anybody know? Leviathan. Hobbes, during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe. I like that word, awe. They are in that conditions called war, and such a war is if every man against every man. So who has to step in to make sure that everybody's protected? The government. The government, or a leader, a supreme leader. I've heard people say benevolent leader. I'm not so sure that works there. Hobbes, to secure against the eternal fear of death, of war, blah, 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 to submit to the Leviathan, the supreme power, the supreme state. And as you look at Unit 1, think about what the state means. Okay, what is the state? And I'm throwing questions at you rather than giving you answers, and that's what good teachers, good mentors, good people do to make you think. And kids always go, well, what's the answer to that? If I gave you the answers, it'd be like every other class, you memorize, regurgitate, and forget. Okay, you got to learn it yourself. Locke, in most natural rights, is based on Locke's theories and ideas. Locke actually wrote some states' constitution.
The Carolinas.
Yeah, the charter, and they based, even though he never stepped foot in America. During the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that conditions called war. Notice the similarity. And such a war as if every man is against every man. Again, fly through this. Government agree to give up their absolute liberties. right? The Bill of Rights, it's not absolute. It was mentioned. You give up some of those rights, you are limited in there. The state exists to enforce property and contract rights. Because property gives you what? Having power. You remember what was one of the requirements? To vote? Property. Okay. And all of this includes foreign enemies as well as domestic criminals. So he said, it doesn't matter if we like you or don't. Okay, like you or don't like you. It's the idea that everybody has these same rights. Oh, you're just counting this. Okay. And then there's a Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Oh, don't say Jean-Jacques. Okay. I've heard that in competitions at state level, and you sit there going, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, every man having been born free and master of himself. No one else may under any pretext whatsoever subject him without his consent. To assert that the son of a slave is born a slave is to assert that he's not born a man. Okay, everybody is. Very different philosophies. Most of the competition and preparation will be Locke-centered, but you have to bring these competing ideas. And as was said earlier by, I think Charlie said it, every unit you want to bring in these natural rights and classical Republican folks there. He argues quasi-scientifically that pre-civilized humans were not warlike. Notice the difference between the other two theories. And that's the big difference there. Hey, I'm going to skip through that. Those of you in Unit 1, did any Unit 1 people read Emile?
We like cited it.
That's the whole thing. When we read Emile, and then it's like we read an excerpt that came on somebody else's meme. All right. What principles of natural rights philosophy would I expect to find in America's documents? We talked about classical Republican. And so natural rights philosophy, the Constitution is a social contract. And we, the people, created the Constitution. Civil War, there was a conflict. Was it we the states or we the people that did this? Who had the right to secede or not secede? The Bill of Rights in early state governments was first. Not every state government had a Bill of Rights, however, okay? But many of them said you have the freedom of speech, or religion were some of the first two parts of their state Bill of Rights. And then the idea of rule of law. Ironically, early state governments, like in Virginia, for example, the government put themselves above the people. That's why Madison wanted a Bill of Rights. Remember, Madison was an anti-federalist, but he was still fighting for the Bill of Rights to apply to the states. And you will learn about that. Constitutions begin with the Bill of Rights. I'm not going to read it, but this is a Virginia Bill of Rights, June 1776. You know, this is before independence. This is just right when they're arguing about it. All men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights. The U.S. Constitution, again, the preamble. Well, that's classical Republican, and it's also natural rights at the same time. There's a written Constitution. Originally, well, name a country that doesn't have a written Constitution.
Britain.
Do they have a rule of law?
Yes.
Yes, they do. Okay, but it's based on different things. I'm not going to. Separation of powers, checks and balances. How many of you read Fed 51 already? Okay, make sure you read Federalist 47. It's more important. Legislative supremacy. Talked about that with the classical Republican. Remember, these ideas stem from classical Republican. And then the ability to elect, to impeach, and remove. That gives the people to elect representatives who can actually put a check on a dictatorial leader. And to finish, I like the Monroe quote, Americans have always managed to weigh the celebration of the individual with responsibility for the community. Market striving within civic caring, the private sphere, and the public good. That's been our balance, and that's our struggle. And when you get to these classical Republican natural rights, make sure you try to bring it forward, historically forward, because that's always been our struggle, always will be our struggle. Okay, that's it. Just a quick overview there. Questions?